strong welcome. My name is Rowan.
And I am Jasmine. We have the honor of serving as your Masters of Ceremonies for today's Journey to Peace, Seminar 8, Transitions from War to Peace.
Before we begin, we would like to recognize the organizations whose partnership makes this seminar series possible. The West Point Society of Hawaii, the Pearl Harbor Rotary Club, our hosts, the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, the Japan America Society of Hawaii, Pathways to Peace, and the East-West Center. Please join us in giving our partners a warm aloha and a round of applause.
We would also like to recognize several very special guests with us today, families whose stories are deeply connected to the history we continue to learn from. First, we are honored to welcome members of the family of Thomas Taro Higa, who served with the 100th Battalion in Italy and later served as an interpreter during the Battle of Okinawa. Mr. Higa went on to play an important role in the humanitarian efforts that helped rebuild Okinawa in the years following World War II. Joining us today are members of his family: Elsie Higa Yoshimura, his daughter; Amy Taniguchi, his granddaughter; Olivia Salvador and Caroline Salvador, his great-granddaughters; and Brian Osterman, Amy's partner and a retired U.S. Marine. We are also honored to welcome John Itomura, grandson, and Michelle Nita, the granddaughter of Shinyei Shimabukuro, and past president of the Hawaii United Okinawa Association. Mr. Shimabukuro was one of the 9 volunteers who organized and delivered 550 pigs to Okinawa in the historic humanitarian mission known as Operation Pigs from the Sea, which helped serve a starving population to begin to rebuild after the war.
We would also like to welcome Mr. Emmanuel Perlman and his wife, Jan. Mr. Perlman is the founder and president of Destination Peace International, which seeks to establish peace through communal singing and other conflict resolution strategies. Please join us in giving these families a warm aloha and our deep For those who have attended previous sessions, welcome back. And for those joining us for the first time, thank you for being a part of this journey. Over the past several seminars, we have examined the final and most devastating chapters of the Pacific War. Beginning with the battles of the Mariana Islands, we moved through the massive campaigns in the Philippines, including Leyte, Luzon, and Manila, where both soldiers and civilians endured extraordinary suffering. Then we explored the brutal escalation of the war in 1945, culminating in the Battle of Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific theater. From there, we examined the final acts of the war, including the introduction of new and devastating weapons, and the difficult aftermath faced by societies across Asia as they confronted destruction, occupation, and the pursuit of justice. These discussions have led us to today's topic: how societies transition from war to peace, and how the legacy of those decisions continues to shape global security today.
Before we begin, a brief disclaimer. Journey to Peace is an unincorporated group of individuals. While today's discussions will present historical information and analysis, these views expressed by our speakers represent their personal perspectives and not those of the organization. Following the panel discussion, we will open the floor for questions from the audience.
Today's discussion will be moderated by Dr. Crissy Gayagas, an educator, community leader, and longtime contributor to programs that promote international understanding and peace. This panel discussion will also be moderated by retired Colonel John Hansen, a professor and strategic studies scholar with extensive experience in military history and international security. Today's panelists are Mr. Jim Moriarty. Jim Moriarty is a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who served as U.S. Ambassador to Bangladesh and Nepal. He also served as Senior Director for Asia at the National Security Council and held senior diplomatic positions in Beijing and Taipei, where he spent a decade working on U.S.-Asia relations. He later served as the chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan, helping guide unofficial relations between the United States and Taiwan. Our next panelist is Mr. Dan Leaf. Lieutenant General Dan Fig Leaf, the U.S. Air Force, is a decorated combat fighter pilot and strategic leader. He previously served as the director of the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu and continues to work on issues related to Indo-Pacific security, conflict resolution, and leadership development. He is also the Honorary Consul General for Vietnam and Hawaii. Our last panelist is Mr. Carl Schuster. Captain Carl Schuster, U.S. Navy retired, served 25 years on active duty and later taught 24 years at Hawaii Pacific University. Today he is a writer and media commentator specializing in Indo-Pacific security and naval affairs.
Thanks, Rowan and Jasmine. How about a round of applause for our MC team? Welcome and thank you for attending, and welcome back for those who've been here before. I hope we have a couple returnees. This is our 8th event, and as the other 7, this will also be recorded. So if you wanted to see this one and the other 7, we have a YouTube channel. We can share that with you. I think it's on the flyer, but we can get that to you as well. Just to echo the thank yous and welcomes for our sponsors, and just to highlight where we are in the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum. Has been our home of base for this past 8 times. Great facility. If you are on the island for any length of time, I'd highly recommend a tour through here. And if you're a resident, for $5 a month, you could become a annual member, and so you get free stuff to include admissions, tickets, and that type of thing. So give that some thought. This is always a humbling treat for me, as you heard the credentials of our panelists. Almost 200 years of experience, diplomatic, military, economic, information, all the national powers represented up here by these 3 gentlemen. It's an extra treat for me today to have my classmate and longtime friend, Dr. Colonel Retired Crissy Gayagas, join us today for the first time. Again, thanks, Crissy. Round of applause for you, maybe again. So, for those that are astute and can trust your eyeballs, you can see that Crissy actually adds a little bit of an ease on the eyes amongst us 4 older dudes. So that's also it's a bonus. It wasn't the intent. The intent is her expertise and wisdom, as you'll see here in just a second. Echoing also our special guests, the family of Thomas Taro Higa and Shinyei Shimabukuro. We'll talk a bit more about those 2 heroes. But this is this is routine for our events. Every time we get together, we spend some time to recognize the heroes of Hawaii. And our little state in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, strategically positioned, of course, has just an amazing percentage of folks that, for this subject, were involved before, during, and after. And particularly tonight, we're going to talk about especially the after. And Manny Perlman, thanks for showing up, and for your family and your guests here. Destination Peace International, yet another organization out there that's organized to sustain the peace, which is clearly a full-time job nowadays especially. If we can go to the overview slide, I'll just step through this real briefly. So 80 years ago today, 1946, the war had ended and the disaster recovery has begun. And we talked about that last time too. Literally a global disaster for anybody with even a passive knowledge of the effects of World War II, especially the effects in the Pacific. So last time we talked about that. We're going to circle back on some of those, do a little bit more of a deep dive on what was going on from, as you can see, you'll see next chart, the war trials, justice, rebuilding, recovery, prevent starvation, all those things that were literally thrown into the laps of the world, particularly the victors, and how they handle that. If you get a chance, just Google any videos of aerial shots of Europe and Japan and some other places, China, on how unbelievably devastating the physical effects of the war were for infrastructure around the embattled areas. It's amazing that we are where we are today, given that start point. This represents kind of the broad questions. What lessons did we learn from transitions prior? Transition from World War I, where arguably it didn't go well in transitions because 20 years later we had World War II. We'll talk a little bit about that today. What national powers are applied in this environment? Typically, classically, kinetic military power is stopped for the most part. Now it's up to diplomatic, informational, economic power. So we'll talk about how that goes, how that went, and how it's affected to today. And there's some good news stories there, obviously. Just look at the former warring parties, if you will, Japan and Germany, and how they look today and how they are like-minded allies for us today. That's a good news story. Okay, with that, let's go to the next slide. So this session, we've got these four basic topics. Crissy and I will tee up some broad questions, and then we'll try our hardest to rein in the panelists as they are keen to go on very, very good explanations. But really excited to hear about today's discussion. And so again, just to kind of get everyone oriented, we're in mid-1946, February to about May, June time frame. And we're looking at the conditions that were set in that time frame that manifest follow-on activities. Some of them are pretty obvious. Things that happened later on, the Korean War, issues with China, and the like. But we're just going to drill down to see what were the conditions that were set during that time frame 80 years ago. And particularly looking again at the applications of justice, rebuilding of institutions, the emergence of new countries, dozens of new countries, as colonialism kind of wanes stubbornly away from the international system. And then what were the seeds of unresolved conflict that we clearly see manifest today? And then these major shifts in the international system from what had been for centuries, states would behave with each other based on interest, power, and greed. The 20th century brings in these disasters that spawn this thinking of maybe more collaborative, cooperative approaches, more liberal approaches would be a better way. And after World War I, it was an effort to try that. Didn't go very well. The League of Nations kind of fell apart because power and greed and realism was still quite alive and well. World War II happens, and back to realism. But now, after this disaster, we're back to more of a liberal institutional approach. We'll talk about one of the key institutions that comes out of the war, of course, the United Nations. But in addition to all those kind of big hand wave things that were going on from a global systems level, from a very personal state level, the grassroots level, there were some things energized by aloha. And I talk about warriors that were turned diplomats or humanitarians, and humanitarians that stepped up. And I give you Thomas Taro Higa and Shinyei Shimabukuro. The plight of the Okinawans we discussed in Journey to Peace number 6. It's online, so Google it. It's worth the spin if you want to see the disaster that Okinawa was and the effect on the people of Okinawa. Taro Higa and Shinyei Shimabukuro literally stemmed starvation in Okinawa. Their efforts are legendary, and they continue to this day as represented by the families here and the continuance of organizations like the Hawaii United Okinawa Association, which is still very much underway. So again, thank you for both families for being here, representing the true greatness, the application and manifestation of the aloha spirit in a global catastrophe. Okay, so let me begin. I'm going to ask the first question of our panelists, and I think what we'll do is we'll just go start with you, General Leaf, for answers, and we'll just go down the line and get your insights. So, this time, 80 years ago, with respect to justice and trials, Tokyo trials and such, there was a tremendous amount of haggling over who would be arraigned, who are the accused. There was haggling over how to seat the bench for the justices, haggling over who would lead that group of justices. And as General Leaf mentioned last session, this is not Nuremberg trials. This is absolutely something completely different. And so with that, the question I'd like to pose to the panel is, what were the challenges and the lessons from a diplomatic engagement standpoint that among the victors, among those that were seating the panel or the tribunal, that drove the actual establishment of it? So, Vig, can I turn that to you?
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and to all the sponsors for making this possible. I'd like to acknowledge the Japanese-American and Okinawan thread that's weaving through here. Both communities suffered and sacrificed, and we should always remember that. This is a difficult question, and it's hard for me not to go counterfactual and imagine what might have been done differently, but the establishing the Far East Tribunal in Japan and then later the Shanghai Tribunal with reference to Nuremberg was a difficult task, and they look very similar, Nuremberg and Tokyo, but they're not, and the considerations were different. The first consideration in establishing U.S. and international community imposed justice on Japan was maintaining order in Japan, because they weren't done yet. And some concessions were made, and the composition of the court, I think, is not that important, and the sentences that were meted out are also not that important. In fact, case by case, name by name, they were harsher in Tokyo than they were in Nuremberg. But there's one thing different about what happened from the Tokyo Tribunal that I think is an outcome perhaps necessary at the moment that skews modern history and current events. And that's that Japan, Imperial Japan, and I want to clearly distinguish between the atrocities of Imperial Japan and modern Japan and even the people. But Japan was never assigned collective blame. Germany was. And that difference is extraordinary. And it matters less to the United States than it does, and I think we'll talk about this, Korea and China and other nations. So in Germany, the follow-on leaders to Hitler, Donitz, etc., were held accountable. Organizations, the Wehrmacht, the SS, Gestapo, were held collectively responsible. Even industrialists were held responsible. And in Japan, having left the emperor on the throne, even with diminished status, but down to organizations and industry, etc., Japan was never assigned collective blame and thus never took on collective contrition. I go to China every year, as you know, as a private citizen in informed support of U.S. government objectives, and I hear it all the time. I'll be in China in April on the anniversary of Doolittle's shoot-down, talking about the extraordinarily brutal campaign after he was rescued in the other Doolittle raiders. It is still a problem. I don't know what to do about that, but that very significant difference of collective blame was not about composition of the court. It was about a very conscious, strategic decision of the United States as the primary power to do two things. One, maintain order in Japan, and two, build a relationship in the nascent Cold War. So I didn't offer you any solutions. I'm just saying it has left us with problems.
And I will go slightly counterfactual here and basically say that if you look at the issues that General Fig raises, I would argue that a lot of them sprung about because of conditions in China, that we did not want to have a huge number of U.S. troops having to occupy Japan at a time when everyone could tell that things were very unsettled in China, the largest country in the region. In theory, one of the victors over Japan, and to be fair, at the time of the Japanese surrender, pick a number. How many Japanese troops in China? 2 million. 1/3 of the entire Japanese military was still in China. We wanted to figure out a way to make sure they didn't continue fighting, and that was part of the assumption. So if you look at what was happening in 1946, things were messy. In Europe, in contrast, you actually had 4 different zones of occupiers. In the U.S., in Japan, the U.S. moved in initially on its own, later on joined by others, including China, in theory. But basically, we were extremely worried after a long, brutal war that we would get into a long, messy occupation. I would argue that thinking is still something that we need to be looking at whenever we get involved in a messy situation is, what does it look like 5 years down the road? I think that's the biggest lesson we can learn. Individuals, being held accountable or not accountable. The Prime Minister of Japan, who was considered the biggest war criminal, was sentenced to hang and committed suicide. And he left behind a very moving note, accepting responsibility for the atrocities committed by Japan during the war. So it wasn't as though it was completely ignored. And I do think that there was this major consideration that Fig touched on, which is, where do you go with the emperor? And does insisting that he was responsible for the situation, does it get you anything? Or does establishing a working relationship with him, and therefore with the Japanese people, does that make more sense? And they opted for that road at that time, and who can say what the alternative would have been going forward?
And there was also a domestic debate within the United States. A man named Morgenthau, who was a very influential financier, he wanted to, in order to eliminate the possibility of Japan and Germany from ever rising again,
He wanted all their industries destroyed, and he wanted them reduced to agrarian societies. They would have no industry, no ability to produce anything on their own except food. And in Europe, Eisenhower was able to convince the president that that's foolish. There aren't enough farmland to employ the Germans, so we're essentially would be assigning them to a lifetime of starvation and unemployment, and MacArthur made the same argument about Japan. The other issue going on in the United States was, would Mao be good for China, or would Chiang? And I'm unfortunately influenced by some family connections. The man I'm named after was part of the Navy team working under Mao in northern China during World War II. And his view of the communists was they weren't corrupt, they were disciplined, they treated the people nicely, and they didn't demand or take money or property from him and his team. His best friend was with the KMT. They abused the people, they were corrupt, they looted. He felt that the last thing we wanted to do was support the KMT. And so what you had was this dichotomy of who was best to be running China. We also landed Marines in northern China. And one of the things we discovered is about a third of the Japanese supply depots we took over were filled with American goods that the KMT had sold to them. And so there was this mindset that they're corrupt, they can't be trusted, right out the door. Now that's working level anecdotes. But that influenced the debate in the United States. It made us look at necessarily not blindly supporting the KMT. Also, my Uncle Carl noted that the Mao didn't have any Soviet advisors. The KMT did. They had Soviet advisors. And so, are they really democratic? At the working level, the perception was no. They're no different from the KGB or whatever. The last thing, too, is there was emerging independence movements in Asia that Britain and France did not want represented and did not want their interest even mentioned. India wanted to be on the trial because they wanted to bring up what the British had done to them in the fight against Indian resistance and desires for independence. The Vietnamese didn't have a voice in it, but they wanted to send representatives because they wanted to bring up the same issue with the French. And so what we had was these competing aspirations of justice. And we went with what we thought was a good balance. Most of what we did at the end of World War II was to avoid the lessons or mistakes that we made at the end of World War I. There's a National Security Council on the UN because the League of Nations failed because the great powers did not have a vote on what the League of Nations would do. They were powerful, they were influenced, but by treating the League of Nations as a parliament of equals, they overlooked the interests of the small countries who didn't want the great powers to dictate what that organization would do. There was also the Japanese disappointment with the League of Nations in that their interests at the end of World War I were ignored. Everyone forgets they were allied with the West in World War I. That mix and play led many American diplomats to look at it and say, the way to eliminate this happening again, we will have a vote. Those of us who won World War II were unified in our view of the world. Not sure that worked out for us. And we will maintain global order. The European representatives, Britain and France primarily, their idea of a world order included them retaining their colonies. The United States was anti-colonial in those days. We would not provide fuel to the French who wanted to send their troops to Indochina. That's how the British wound up occupying South Vietnam. Now, all that added together, you can see that's a complicated mix. And you're going to hold a war crimes trial. And so the debates or disagreements about how to form the trial was a background. Now, once the trial was underway, the very factors that the general brought up came into play. We have to maintain order in Japan. That was our priority. But to France and Britain, we need to assure justice for our subjects and our troops. And so that drove the way the Tokyo Tribunal went. But if you look at the Singapore trials, you'll notice the British influence was more significant. So All those are in play, and it's much more complicated than Nuremberg, where there was a general agreement among the powers who participated in the war, how to proceed. Thank you, by the way, for coming, and appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks. Before I hand off to Crissy, we touched on a couple of things that she's going to tee up as well, but I do want to mention the fact that the Tokyo trials were an element of the meting out of, if you will, of justice. There were other trials, as mentioned here, to include lesser battlefield justice that doesn't get a whole lot of play. So that whole picture is part of the whole the justice follow-on to the war. So, Crissy, over to you.
First of all, thanks, John, and to all of you for making this program happen and for all of your efforts. So following World War II, there were drastically different outcomes between the reestablishment of governance in Korea and Japan. So in Japan, in a relatively short amount of time, they were able to implement stability and a democratic government. And Korea struggled, and the regime conflict eventually led to the Korean War. Now, certainly there were differences in the approaches and the circumstances. In Japan, there was a unified effort, as mentioned, and it allowed MacArthur to make some key decisions related to leadership, his input on who was tried or not, including the emperor. And in Korea, there was a bifurcation with the 38th parallel, of course, Soviet Union occupying in the north to oversee the removal of the Japanese forces, and the U.S. led in the south. So while in Japan, MacArthur was able to oversee the writing, rewriting, and implementation of a constitution, he also made key decisions related to economic reform that he oversaw, the dismantling of the Baizatsu, the large family conglomerate networks, and again, the British Commonwealth of Occupation Forces also was part of it, and as alluded to, the Chinese were sending in a division to help with the removal of forces. Now, Korea, on the other hand, had extended colonization over 3 decades and under strict military rule, and their institutions started with much lesser capacity and capability. So there's a lot to be learned from these 2 case studies, and I'd like to ask our panelists to discuss some of the challenges in rebuilding in Japan and Korea, and as importantly, the lessons learned that we might be able to apply to today's operating environment. Survey.
I will start off just with one entry. Yeah, and I will quickly add that I'm probably the least expert person on Korea here, but I am able to draw comparisons between the 2 most important Japanese colonies before World War II, one being Korea, the other one being Taiwan. Korea resisted Japanese colonization pretty vigorously, and the Japanese occupation of Korea was pretty brutal by just about any terms. The Kempeitai, the secret police, were the real power. In Taiwan, and I'll give you one reason I heard why, but Taiwan, the occupation was much more liberal, and it was focused on developing Taiwan as a contributor to the wealth of Japan, with some fairly progressive ideas. That meant you needed a well-educated populace. That meant that you needed industries. Extraction might have been the ultimate goal, just the resources and the shipment of wood and the sugar. But basically, to do that, you needed to develop a modern economy. So you ended up getting universal education for the first time in Taiwan. The children were all taught Chinese. Many of them went off to Tokyo and other Japanese cities for higher education. Roads got built, industries got built. And I tell you, if you go to Taiwan and ask the average Taiwanese what do they think about the average Japanese, you'll get an extremely positive response. Oh, they're so kawaii ne, they're so cute, and you get the same thing going the other way when you talk to Japanese about Taiwanese. There is a respect, almost bordering on affection for the two. And if that's a lesson that anybody can learn, I hope they do, that basically over the longer term, basing your relationship not just on power and the ability to repress, but on working towards common goals. The Taiwanese wanted education, they wanted good roads, they wanted modern industry, and the Japanese were able to provide that. Whereas in Korea, it was largely pretty brutal an occupation. So I'll stop there.
If I may, Japanese occupation in Taiwan was run by the Japanese Navy. And to the naval officers, since their promotions were based on serving at sea, a tour in Taiwan was based on whether there were problems. And also Japan was lucky in Taiwan. The Taiwanese had just finished rebelling against the Manchu authorities because they were corrupt and abusive. So the Japanese come in, and as long as you didn't resist what the Japanese were doing, they didn't see you as a problem. Plus, the Japanese Navy didn't want to be involved in running local affairs, so they let the local Chinese authorities run things. All they asked is they be loyal to the emperor. And then they built the infrastructure, free hospital care, free education, which the Taiwanese had never had before. So in addition to the roads, and in addition to building the infrastructure, they provided free health care. And they developed a retirement plan, something Taiwan had never had.
Yep. If I may interject, I think you're both sugarcoating Japanese occupation of Taiwan to a degree, because the reason it looks so good is it's contrasted with the hostile takeover of the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. So their memories are shaped by the brutal descending of the mainlanders onto the island. And so there's some rose-colored glasses there. It was probably the best conditions of occupation in all of Asia by the Japanese, but it wasn't totally benevolent. On the other hand, brutal is not a strong enough word for the colonization of Korea. It was horrible, and it fractured all elements of society in Korea. The Japanese intentionally took apart Korean society, education, hierarchy, all of that, language. They took it apart. So why would somebody think that drawing a straight line on the 38th parallel and leaving the settlement of that undone would work? I mean, of all the things we've done in our history is international power, that might be the dumbest. And we're still paying the price. So we shouldn't overlook just how destructive the colonization and occupation of Japan was, and then how we tried to simplify it and say, okay, we'll deal with this later, sort of like Berlin, but totally unlike East and West Germany. We're going to just draw a line here and it'll all work out. It didn't work out. It hasn't worked out because it couldn't work out. There was just nothing there to be solved or negotiated. And frankly, I'm not a fanboy for Kim Jong-un, but I do think that his declaration, 26 months ago, that they're two separate nations, not that I want Korea to be two separate nations, but I'm not sure there's any other choice.
I do feel to disagree on one point, and that is, it's not rose-colored glasses. Remember, the Taiwanese judged the Japanese occupation comparing it to what the Manchus did and what the Kuomintang did when they arrived. And so if you look, for example, when I was in Long Beach, my next door neighbor had married an American to get out of Taiwan because she was a member of the Taiwanese resistance movement, the KMT. KMT killed nearly 100,000 Taiwans taking over the government, and their martial law suppressed an independence movement right up until 1984. And the other thing that happened is the first group of KMT that arrived in 1946, the first thing they did was shut down the free education, shut down the hospitals, and they started ripping up the railroads and selling them, selling the rails. And so the first 4 years of KMT occupation, the standard of living declined by almost 70%. And so it's not a matter of rose-colored glasses. We Americans tend to think of as either good or bad. It's a comparison to what was before and what followed. The Japanese required them to study Japanese. The Japanese required them to be loyal to the emperor. And in cultural competitions and things, usually there was a Japanese winner because the judges were Japanese. But in terms of civil society, universal education was an unknown concept in mainland China and in Taiwan before the Japanese arrived. Most people would argue that's a good thing. The Chinese did away with universal health care. You had to pay a KMT official to get any health care. And so the level of corruption was just exponentially worse than the Manchus.
If I could just jump in here real quick. Sorry, Big and Carlos. So we've kind of jumped into like 1949, which I understand, but if we could just ratchet it back to a couple of follow-ons here. One is, what was going on in the agreements penned amongst the victors, particularly in Potsdam, that generated this bizarre agreement on the peninsula, and what was going on with the victor, China, to where we get to a thing like Taiwan. If we can just back up on that.
Well, China wasn't a coherent victor at that time, as the ambassador said. There is still uncertainty about the outcome of the civil war there, and that it wasn't an entity that could have a coherent voice because, yeah, but that victor was amorphous, right? It wasn't like Mao or Chiang Kai-shek could say, here's what we're going to do about this, right? It had yet to be decided, and so there's not somebody to speak up and take the role, and I think that's part of the residual failure to conduct a truth and reconciliation process with China, because China didn't exist as a government, as an entity. It was an idea.
Good points, Fig. I'd also like to point out that if we're going back to 1946, maybe we should go back a little bit further. Go back to the day the war ends in Europe. Okay, what's going to happen next? Well, you've still got a war raging in the Pacific. Many of the victors are directly implicated on that. So you got the three big guys meeting, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt. They're looking at a future world, but they're most importantly looking at how the heck do we end this thing as quickly as possible, the fighting in the Pacific that continues to rage. And so you end up with declarations meant to get the Japanese to surrender, an important part of which is the Soviets agree that, look, as soon as we can, and they made a commitment on a firm date, we are going to invade China. We are going to send our troops. We've got massive military capability. We're going to be the straw that breaks Japan's back. And indeed, they kept their word. They did that. Massive numbers of Soviet troops, very well-planned attacks into China's northeast, very successful attacks. But this wasn't altruism on Joe Stalin's part. He had a long history. Russia had a long history. Soviet Union had a long history with Japan, with territories that Japan had, that China had, that the Russians and then the Soviets thought legitimately belonged to them. And they wanted to become the dominant power in Northeast Asia again. And so that's what you were seeing play out with respect to Korea, with respect to the Civil War in China even, because ultimately the Soviets decide, hey, look, we do have a dog in this fight. We do want somebody who's dependent on us to win. So part of what they did is they did like they did in Europe. They stripped Northeast China, which was the most productive and industrially advanced part of the country, of virtually all of the industrial things that would move. They took the surrender of the Japanese troops, and like I said, a huge number of troops, and a huge amount of weapons. And they turned over a lot of those weapons to Mao's forces that were engaged in the Civil War that once again by 1946 was booming after a couple of years where we were trying to convince the Chinese communists and the KMT to work together. For a while they actually did fight together against the Japanese, but mostly both were trying to reserve their power to ultimately win that civil war that both sides, the KMT and the Chinese communists, realized would be resolved eventually. So,
Can we jump forward to 2026? You don't mind, do you? Because we are talking about lessons, and that, the entry of the Soviet Union then into the Northeast Asia battle with their issues with the Japanese, the fact that it wasn't an altruistic protection of the Chinese, and then subsequently what happened in North Korea. Here's what I would tell you, and I believe this is a truth I hold self-evident. Any notion of a China, North Korea, Russia partnership is baloney, okay? Anytime there are two of those or three of them, all three of them are feigning a friendship, it ain't true. It's an arranged marriage. It's not going to last. The antipathy is deep, 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 and it's not going away.
The only thing I can add to that is historically the Korean people, period, have felt that their survival as a culture is dependent upon playing the powers around them against each other. The key that divided them was Syngman Rhee, of course. His exile was in the United States, so he had a more Western view. Kim Il-sung was a major in the Soviet Army in 1945, and when the Soviets occupied Northern Korea, his competitors for power in the Korean Workers' Party disappeared. But both South and North Korea share one common theme, and I'll defer to the general because he knows it better than I do, he personally experienced it, is they both feel that they need to be independent in and of themselves, but they cannot ignore the prison of geography. They are surrounded by powers, and their independence is based on playing those powers against each other. Relying on one or more when they must, relying on themselves is the balance between them. And so I share your view, sir, that they have become separate countries. They have almost separate cultures now.
So much for control. Yeah, I think that's a point very well taken, and in my travels to China, I deal less with Russians. God. I've observed something I call North Korea anxiety disorder. The Chinese have this angst about North Korea because the North Koreans have played that card so well. They know when to deal it to Russia and when to draw it from China. And it's a palpable angst about all things North Korea. They're masters at it.
Okay, if I could tug on that string just a little more, and go back to 1945 and the loss, European theater's over, The Pacific is still underway. And this meeting that happens, I think, I'm asking you mentioned Roosevelt and Churchill, because they weren't there. Roosevelt was dead and Churchill got voted out of office, but not to troubleshoot the ambassador. Who wasn't there? So if I didn't know anything about the war other than that, the Allies that included big country like China won the war. The people of China, maybe, not to get buried in that argument again. I would expect as a high school senior to say, oh, so they had this meeting, but not everyone was there.
They had this meeting, but this gets up to something that Fig stressed, and I kind of raised a little bit, which is, who the heck was China? You know, at the beginning of the war, there was frequently attempts to try and get Chiang Kai-shek involved. And as the war went on, and particularly I would argue by 1945, when the Soviets are thinking about what's our future in East Asia, don't forget there were a whole lot of territorial claims against China by the Russian/Soviet state. So they had no interest in having a Chinese voice be heard on the future of East Asia, absolutely none. And frankly, as we were saying earlier, you saw this division among Americans even in the sense of who do we want running China in the future? Not only who is in control now, but who would we like to see when we all realized that the Civil War was beginning to already heat back up. So I don't have a good feel for the diplomatic history, but just looking at the sweep of events, I would say that by 1945, the interest of having a real Chinese voice in the inner discussions about the future of Asia had declined quite a bit on both the Soviet and the U.S. side.
And I'd say if you decided you want a Chinese voice from either side, and then the who question would stymie that. There was no China in a structural sense.
So would that be a notable lesson, a challenge? I mean, if we look to 2026, we have allies that are sharing battle space with each other to fight an enemy, which is China, Burma, India theater. What can we, from a historical sense, take away from that as a lesson or challenge?
What if there's no more Iran? Just to come back to 2026. You know, when you look at, there are two lessons I'd bring from the current circumstances. One is if you're seeking international or unconditional surrender from a fanatical enemy, somebody has to do that, and that's part of why the emperor was still alive at the end of the war. Okay? We're down to number 148 on the hierarchy. So who's going to do that? If the Shia side of Iran is decimated to the point that they don't exist, but the others are unorganized, who do you negotiate that surrender with, and then how do you craft the future? That's not a commentary on what's going on, it's just I think that's a problem. And we should learn from, A, how difficult it is to defeat a fanatical enemy, and B, what do you do afterwards?
I'll quickly add to those thoughts. Now, one thing that people should always keep in mind, and this applies to Iran, I would say too, is there really are core national interests and core leadership interests. You should actually have to take those into account. You should realize that the Soviets were the successor to Russians who had what they considered core interests that were because of Japanese victories, but also confusion in China. Basically, you had a Soviet Union coming off of huge victories in Europe that wanted to reshape Asia, and we weren't looking at it that much. And then we get down to the question of political leaders. Core national interests are important, and they're usually got a great deal of continuity. But leaders, depending on their power and their background, can be very, very different. And the strengths that a system gives those leaders. Right now, as you can tell, I'm kind of a China hand. We have a China that's unlike anything we have seen since Mao Zedong's day. We've got something that is much more analogous to Putin's Russia than we have, than any comparison to the previous collective leadership in China. And as we find throughout the world and throughout history, one man, one woman political systems are extremely hard to predict, and you have to be pretty cautious in dealing with them. I like to point out to people that the single most important decision that Xi Jinping has taken since he took power in 2012 was a decision that nobody predicted. You know, the way that he lifted the COVID-19 restrictions, we had no clue that was coming. The people of China had no clue it was coming. Xi Jinping's advisors had no clue that it was coming the way it did. Everybody was saying, okay, these restrictions are hurting our economy, we've got to do something. Nobody was telling him that we have to lift it overnight, and we're not going to build any extra ICU facilities, we're not going to vaccinate anybody, we're just going to tell everybody to go to work tomorrow, and it will burn itself out. And it did. 1.5 million people dead later on, and the economic recovery slowed down much slower than it could have been if there was a logical escape clause. And to top it off, 2 weeks before that, the debate seemed to have stopped. Xi Jinping seemed to have sent the word that he did not want to hear about it anymore. The indications in the media and in conversations with Chinese dried up. And then 2-3 weeks later, boom, overnight. His fingerprints are not on the order. It's just kind of a passive voice. As of tomorrow morning, all restrictions are lifted. There will be no further lockdowns. There will be no additional testing. Stunning. Huge, huge impact on the country. Negative, almost all negative. Why did he do it? Well, the only change that might have driven him to that decision in the 2-week period were, for the first time during his rule, there were protests in over 20 Chinese cities protesting against the lockdowns, and even in a few cases calling for Xi Jinping to step down. I'm raising this to say that, you know, we have difficulties analyzing one-man systems because, frankly, they're extremely unpredictable. And we have to be careful when we look at a place, and let's face it, part of what we're talking about is instability that continues to this day. From the American perspective, we see that largely coming from China. The Chinese would argue it's largely coming from the United States. And I think we both have a tough time predicting what the other side is going to be doing. And so that's one of the things that I stress constantly is the contacts with as many people as possible in as many venues as possible is about as good as we can do, and frankly is about as good as the Chinese can do right now as we both try to, you know, the Chinese have a great saying, it's Mangren Mo Xiang, which literally translates as the blind man feeling the elephant. Our systems are so different, our countries are so big, the conditions vary so much that we've got to try and understand each other to the extent possible while recognizing that we both can be surprised. We'll stop there.
So if we could, because we've only got a few more minutes before we want to open up the floor to questions, would like to just pull the thread, one more topic on Taiwan. John was asking who was not there for some of these discussions, and then the question might be what was not in the San Francisco treaty that has perpetuated some of the ongoing issues today, specifically with Taiwan. So the Cairo Declaration 1943 somewhat indicated that Taiwan would be returned to China as Japan surrendered. The Potsdam Declaration had similar language, but when it came to the treaty in 1951 in San Francisco, it did not specify who Taiwan was aligned to. And I think Ambassador Moriarty can clean up some of that language, but sir, if you could just sort of expound on that, where we are with some of the language and lessons learned for today, and additional insight.
This gets back to the confusion over who is China. And so I think in the initial declarations, you could say they were done in good faith, basically just saying, oh yeah, we say that goes back to China, just like Alsace-Lorraine goes back to France. You know, there's no real doubt about what is meant. By 1951, there's a lot of confusion about what the heck we're talking about. And at that point, do you mean the Republic of China, which was in power at the time of those declarations, in theory in control of almost all of China, in practice, a civil war going on. So, like I said, the first couple you could say were in good faith, just assuming that everybody knows who China is, just like everybody knows who the United States is. Third one, it's by then the question is, well, do you want to give it to a revolutionary government in Beijing? Do you want to keep it with Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China? The initial takeover, the end of the Civil War is pretty brutal. As we're saying, Chiang Kai-shek's takeover of Taiwan is also extremely brutal. So where do you go? And I think they basically stuck with the same language because nobody had a better formulation.
And I think we have to remember that the world's a big place, right? See, Captain Obvious, it still lives. And there were so many problems to solve, and some of these were lesser included cases. It's not that they weren't discussed at length, but I believe, as playing the amateur historical psychiatrist or psychologist, that there's a lot of decision fatigue, and you get to, we're just not going to drill this down because it's unsolvable. And the same for the division of Korea. Who knew Taiwan would become Taiwan, modern Taiwan? It wasn't that important. Who knew South Korea would become the economic miracle that it did, and then North Korea would become a nuclear threat? They were lesser included cases, I believe.
Good points, and I will quickly throw in that to add even more uncertainty, neither the People's Republic of China, the folks in Beijing, the communist rulers in Beijing, nor Chiang Kai-shek sitting with the KMT in Taiwan acknowledged that the Civil War was over. So now we are still awaiting the victor, I don't know.
Sir, I think the other thing too is because we were just reaching decision fatigue, we also didn't have a lot of expertise on the local conditions. One of the things that wasn't apparent until the late 50s was when the war ended, only about 10% of the Taiwan population wanted union with China. 30 to 40%, depending on who you read and believe, wanted to be an independent country. Another portion of the population wanted to have the same status as Okinawa. And there was a portion of the population that wanted to be an autonomous province within China. And so if you don't have the locals unified, in fact, the first KMT troops to arrive in 1946 were welcome. They thought they would bring order. But unfortunately, the signs discussed how the locals wanted to work with the KMT. KMT officials looked at that and said, no, you work for us. And in the rather contentious meetings that took place over the next 3 weeks, a group of Taiwanese students protested, saying they wanted democracy. They wanted the same choices they had under the Japanese. They were almost killed to a person. And that triggered a lot of the bad feelings between the KMT and the Taiwanese. But for us, as the general very aptly said, it was a lesser included problem. And the other thing, too, that we often forget is the majority of our own military wanted out. We had troops demonstrating in Europe and in Japan who wanted to go home. We didn't want to continue fighting. Plus, economically, we were in debt to 110% of our GNP at those days. And we were looking at it and saying, we really can't afford it. There was pressure to lower the taxes. All this is going on, and so you have 3 levels of contention among the decision makers. I need to make this all go away now, but I got to do it in a way that solves the problem we just ended, and I have to do it in a way that at least lives some semblance of order and control in the areas we want to control. So it was I'd say a contentious mix, and it's hard to criticize the decisions they made when you consider all the conditions they faced. So, my father had a saying, there are no panacea decisions out there. There's only the best you can get out of what you have. Go for it. Of course, he was a warrant officer. They tend to think that way.
Okay, a Navy warrant officer, I think, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just make sure that's clear. So this has been great. I think what jumps to mind, and then we'll open up for questions, is the primacy of political objective. And there are a series of political objectives that predate the war, and they don't go away. The war comes in, and there's military objectives, which are, oddly enough, fairly cut and dried. You know pretty much when it's over. These latent political objectives, and I'll just throw out a couple. The status quo of colonial empires, these Chinese Civil War embedded objectives on both sides, the Soviet Union's expansionist objectives. The war, I would suggest, kind of gets dumped into that environment, and of course it's a traumatic system-changing event, so it affects those objectives, but they don't go away, and they seem to reemerge. I think that might be kind of a fair political science kind of mealy-mouthed description. So let me just let's now shift gears to you all, and I think we have some mics that we can bring out to the audience, and get your questions on this subject, but really anything that talks about journey to peace in general. So any questions out there? I can't really see. Oh, it's Gil, okay.
Well, it works. That's a glorious thing. You know, I wanted to pose to the panel through our wonderful facilitators. We entered into this war, particularly in the Pacific, with a not very comfortable peace situation before the war. We went through the war and we came out the far end after some horrible situations, quite a bit of technology changes, quite a bit of changes in the way people looked at the world situation. But my question is, did we achieve a better peace? And if so, when? If we did, have we gotten there yet, 80 years later? A better situation for the world than what we entered into at the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 1940s? That's my question for the group here.
What time did they lock the doors? Because we won't get there. I mean, that would be an endless debate. What happened? A, we won. The free-ish world won. B, Japan emerged. Germany emerged. The Cold War didn't end in a blinding flash of nuclear detonations. So cool. Very imperfect. Here's what I struggle with and think about more than I should. Goes to back to John talking about the political solutions. I think more about the moral solutions, about the truth and reconciliation. And, you know, I've been there and done more than my share of killing in combat. And I don't think we closed that deal. I don't think that maybe it's not possible. But I think we were so, and who isn't, you're eager to move on. But the hard work of truth and reconciliation was never completed in several ways. We talked about the tribunals, so they were stilted to get a better future. But what about the 300,000 Japanese who were killed in a retribution, or 300,000 Chinese who were killed in a retribution campaign after Doolittle's raiders were rescued? Who's made it right for them? And truth and reconciliation, that's such an incredibly difficult process, you know, from Nepal or Sri Lanka or East Timor or anywhere there's been fighting. But I think we should structure into our diplomacy and politics some thought about the morality. I'll go on just a bit. You know, in Sri Lanka they had a horrible 40-year war, right? Horrible civil war. And the government finally said enough is enough and won it in brutal fashion, but they won it. And frankly, it's kind of hard to argue with that after 40 years of the Tamil Tigers and all that was going on there. But I was there several years ago talking to him and talking about truth and reconciliation and moving forward, and a Sri Lankan general officer said, you know, how do we get past this? You know, we won, but we've still got this isolated element of the population, and we are in good faith trying to draw them in, and it's not working. He said, what should we do? And for once, and probably the only time, I had a brilliant idea. I said, well, you guys get veterans benefits, right? Your military, those who served in the Civil War, right? Okay, bring them into your veterans programs, your veterans benefits. They were in the war too. The war is over. You have to move on. And I think that's what I struggle with looking at all wars is afterwards, how do you truly reconcile? And that's why I'm frankly the honorary consul for Vietnam, because I think the U.S.-Vietnam situation is an example. I'm not Vietnamese, just in case the lighting's bad. It is an exemplar for truth and reconciliation. Is it perfect? No. What did it take? Hard work talking about hard things. Do we agree on all those? Hell no. But we have those conversations, not just about the practical, but about the moral.
Wow. I guess, you know, like I said earlier, I'm kind of a systems guy. And I despair that we don't have control over every system in the world. Every country has its own history, its own politics. And frankly, the thing that really confuses me is how do you stop a country that you see going down the wrong road? I mean, I guess it was 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine by Putin. We didn't do too much. The world didn't do too much. Meanwhile, he's going into Georgia. He's doing all this stuff and destabilizing Europe. And you're going, wow, what can you do against somebody like that? How do you rein it under control? That was what the UN was supposed to be able to do, more than the League of Nations. But the vetoes in the Security Council rendered it inoperative on the major cases. Anybody who has a veto will make sure that the UN no longer interferes in its affairs, and the Russians will make sure that they never again walk out of important meetings. You know, I just don't have a solution. You know, we don't have a panacea. I am a firm believer in democracies do not tend to fight other democracies. I am a believer that there are human rights for every single human being on this planet. The UN actually has a fairly strong code that nobody suffers for violating. And I don't even know what the solution is. I do think working together with democracies and even with kind of reasonable authoritarian states who recognize the danger to the world of large powers that are getting increasingly out of control. Somebody mentioned, as we were talking about this question about the 1930s, wow, does this seem like the 1930s? One invasion by a large power of a small country leads to another invasion. One outrageous claim by a great power leads to another outrageous claim. And I'm not going to name names here, but the parallels with what happened in the 1930s are too strong. And we do, and this is why we're doing this really, is to get people a little bit energized. Saying, okay, where's my small piece of this puzzle? How can I help support whatever it is, whether it's the Rotary clubs building strong relations with their counterparts in Japan, in Taiwan, that helps. Anything we can do to be in touch with the Chinese people helps. It's tough. The Chinese people are scared of their own government, and their own government has really good surveillance capabilities. But anytime you see a Chinese tourist in Honolulu, be friendly. Ask them for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, depending on which city they're coming from. Get to know them a little bit. And sort of say, well, where do you want to be in 10 years? And you're going to find a Chinese who's thinking about the same thing as you. Okay, want to make sure I got decent health care. Want to make sure that my kids are doing well, or my kid is doing well. So anyhow, I'll stop there, but the question is a great one, and the solutions are really difficult.
The only thing I can add is to echo the general's comment, Tito at the end of World War II limited punishment to the officers of the groups he fought. The enlisted troops got the same benefits as the enlisted troops that fought for Tito. He did that for a very deliberate reason, to reconcile rather than lead to a divided country. And I would also argue, look at Nelson Mandela's policies after he took over South Africa. In order to reconcile, you have to do reconciliation. Revenge only sets the ground for more revenge. And to echo the ambassador's point, when you meet with tourists or visitors from other countries, keep in mind that your interaction with them goes back to their country, and you don't want to be the American or the foreigner who is a mirror or echo of what their government has said about us. If you're a racist or abusive or just downright rude to a foreign visitor when he goes back or she goes back to her country, well, yeah, Americans don't like us. And their government may already be telling them that. So you become kind of a reinforcer of the government propaganda. So behave in a way that undermines that narrative. And as a general rule, that may create some counter pressure against negative actions. May not, but it can't hurt. So with that, I'll turn it down. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to thank you for what a brilliant set of answers with information that had never dawned on me before, that is somewhat reminiscent of the reconciliation at the end of the American Civil War. Let's remember that some of the last Confederate widows and children have finally passed away, having received pensions for over 100 years, based on their states that those Confederates fought from, and in a remarkable situation that you have described with Tito, with the thought that that should have been done in Sierra Leone, etc. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
And it's in our roots as Americans. In the Declaration of Independence, we say that, okay, this is not a fight we chose, I'm paraphrasing obviously, and when it's done, we will reconcile with Britain. It's the way we should be.
Other questions out there?
thank you, panelists, for doing that. And also, 80 years ago, Winston Churchill gave a speech in the United States. It was a very famous speech, the Sinews of Peace. In that speech, he said, "It is a solemn moment for American democracy. For with primacy and power, it is also joined in awe-inspiring accountability to the future." And so I was wondering how you would grade or hold the United States to account, given the lessons that we discussed here in the post-war period in the Pacific, and how we can apply those lessons to our conflicts today.
I give us a B. You know, that's a good but very difficult question to answer. There are things that we have really mangled. The origins of Bangladesh come to mind, the coup in Chile. You know, there are things where American influence wasn't helpful, but by and large, because we're a nation of principles, founded on principles, not geography or the ethnicity, we've done okay. Could we have done better? You know, I struggle with the outcome of the tribunals and the reconciliation with Japan that I think was a bilateral great success and a regional failure that we're still reaping the bitter harvest of. But you know what? How about without us? Let's go back to the Civil War. This is something I ponder a lot in my old age. What if Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain hadn't given his speech at Little Round Top and 108 of the 112 mutineers from another Maine regiment hadn't picked up arms and fought with them until they were out of ammunition and stemmed the rebel charge? The Union would have lost at Gettysburg. I almost think that's inarguable. If they lost at Gettysburg, they almost certainly would have lost the Civil War. So if you want to do counterfactual supposition, imagine the world in the 20th century without a United States of America. So compared to the alternative, I'd say a B.
Since I always have to amplify a bit, I'm a diplomat, we like to talk. I'm up to at least a B+ once you start looking at the counterfactuals of Asia. Okay, you had a defeated Japan, let's assume that. So there's a vacuum. What fills that vacuum? Like we keep on saying, Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao Zedong's China. Do we think that that constellation of power in Asia would serve anybody's interests? And, you know, I'm not going to do away with the United States entirely, and I'll say, wow, to have those two powers controlling mainland Asia and being able to project their power at will into the Western Pacific, which means into the Central Pacific. And I get right back to, hey, we folks in Hawaii are once again at risk from very hostile, aggressive, expansionist powers.
The only thing I can add is to support the general's statement. What if it wasn't for the United States? The question's difficult to answer for a variety of reasons, but the most important of which was we weren't the only player. We weren't the only player. And so could we have constrained the Soviet Union, for example, who was trying to establish a foothold of dominance on the Asian mainland? My view is we could not. The American people weren't willing to go through what would have been necessary. Would the people of Korea supported our effort to do that? And I would argue probably not. Because there's a matter of perception too. Were we going to be another colonial power? If you're a foreigner going into a place that just tossed off a colonial power, the first question in the locals' minds are you here to colonize? Are you here to colonize for yourself? One of the problems we encountered in Somalia is we were saying, hey, surrender your weapons, we're going to give you an orderly society, and things are going to get better. It's an attractive message, but that's not the way they interpreted it. They looked at it and said, that's what the Europeans said. They said if we surrendered our military capabilities and let them rule us, then there would be order, ra-da-ta-da. The next thing they know, we're telling us what to do. What guarantee do we have the Americans won't be different? And the answer is, well, because we are different. Well, that's not a convincing argument. So I'm with the general. I think we got to be, but largely because, plus that area, and we didn't control the other players. So we based it on what we could do, or what we believed we could do. And I think we did very well considering that.
So what do we take from that? Do we gotta be, all right, I passed, that's better than me in high school or college? What lesson do we learn, and what do we take forward? We are an exceptional nation, not because we deserve it, but just because of circumstances. And we've been able to bring exceptional progress to the world, never alone, but never without us either. And instead of hubris, that should make us humble. We should have a sense of responsibility for it, not a sense of accomplishment, a sense that we have to keep trying and that we'll never get it right. We shouldn't be deterred by our failures, nor intoxicated by our success.
I think we have another question, but I'd just like to add back to this question some thoughts. I think it's important to remember we're kind of a reluctant, more isolationist bent country, and I think that still kind of endures. But we entered World War II. We were not the powerful U.S. We was a multipolar world. We were certainly outclassed and outmanned and outgunned by other nations. And so the difference is our resources and our capacity to arm ourselves tremendously, which should have been obvious. Obviously, history will show that how silly it was, particularly for Japan, to start a war against the U.S. And some of the decision makers knew that. Anyway, so I would grade us as, given the fact that we had entered into this catastrophe as kind of not a first-rate military, maybe a second-rate. It's kind of generous, maybe. And we emerge as this tremendous power that I think is arguably for good. It's no surprise that the United Nations headquarters is in this country. It's no surprise that we were the ones that championed that, and for the most part still do. Maybe contemporarily now there's some issues, but we were the probably the liberal institutionalist champions in the 20th century. We're the ones that kind of pushed that, shifting from power, interest-based behaviors to let's collaborate, cooperate. There's advantages to that. That would go beyond just power and interest and security issues. So I'd say I'd say A minus. A minus.
That's my profession.
Another question out there? I think we had, sir.
Yeah, I'm jumping forward. You want to handle this or not?
We'll get you, Mike.
Gary, Mike.
I'm jumping you forward. You may not want to handle this to 2026 and today. What position do you think right now Russia and China are both thinking about taking in the Middle East situation?
Middle East meaning Iran, right?
Well,
Specifically,
or Asia, yeah. Pretty good.
I mean that's
the whole world.
I guess we'll find out, won't we?
Yeah.
How's that for an answer? I think it's a conundrum more for China than for Russia. And, if we're playing a game of Risk, it'd be fun to watch. It's real war, so it's not that much fun to watch. But I'd like to, would you like to be with the office with Xi Jinping when they talk about, okay, that's a lot of oil, we can buy it elsewhere. But really, you know, what is the global credibility that they have? They had a strategic partnership with Iran. They've provided some support apparently, but they're not throwing them a lifeline, nor did they Venezuela. So it's a pretty interesting time for China, and I think their long-term response will say a lot about the future of China.
Here's a working one. Here's a working one that I don't know how to work. It's pretty clear that China doesn't want to touch this Iran issue with a 10-foot pole. You know, they don't have any good responses. Look at what happened last year when we bombed the Iranian nuclear facilities. Absolutely nothing. You know, and internally, the Chinese were coming up with explanations as to why it was in China's interest to do nothing. A lot of it was, well, you know, the Iranians are unreliable, they're selling their oil more cheaply to the Europeans than to us, they don't deserve our support. But I'll actually walk it back and say, we worry about Chinese diplomacy quite a bit, and we should. But we also have to keep in mind the Chinese diplomacy is almost entirely transactional. Okay? I'll do this for you if you can give me this. Well, when you're getting bombed pretty seriously by Israel and the United States, there's not much that China can ask for from Iran, that they can. Same thing with Venezuela. You know, what are they going to do? You know, Venezuela's a heck of a long way away. There's stuff going on that they can't influence. Last thing they want to do is to get the U.S. or Israel intercepting arms shipments to regimes that no longer exist as they did when they were close partners. So I think this is a confusing world for the Chinese right now, and they like predictability. We were talking earlier about, you know, why are the Chinese right now, just over the past 2-3 weeks, not engaged in a whole lot of military pressure on Taiwan? It's almost overdue. I think the answer to that is, for the Chinese, the upcoming summit between Xi Jinping and President Trump is hugely important. They don't want to goof it up by doing something in the immediate run-up to that summit that really forces an unpredictable U.S. president to do something that they really wouldn't like. They don't want to ruin the atmosphere for that summit. So right now, in general, I think they're being pretty cautious in what they do with respect to U.S. specific interests. We'll see that could end quickly. Like I said, there you have one man in charge, and he's going to make his own decisions. Getting back to what information he hears, by and large, he hears what his people think he wants to hear. It takes a very brave man when you have ongoing purges to say, President Xi, or you've got this all wrong, your policies are mistaken. Well, you know, that could well be a career ender. I'll stop there.
The only thing I can add to that is the Chinese traditionally look at the Middle East as a resource sump. If you get heavily involved, you'll wind up expending more resources than you'll get back. Now, oil's critical, but it's not their only source. The other thing, too, is they'll do the minimum that will maintain the appearance of sustaining the relationship. They're providing intelligence, but they're doing it through a cutout. A so-called private Chinese company is providing imagery to the Iranians. Well, there are no private satellite companies in China, but it provides plausible deniability. They're going on a political stage, they're criticizing what we're doing, but here's the dilemma they face. We look at the relationship they have with Iran and say, boy, this is bad. But what people don't understand is China's been making overtures to Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Oman. And if they take a position in favor that seems even openly to support Iran, then that will destroy the overtures and advances they've made in those other countries, particularly since Iran attacked those other countries. And so the Chinese dilemma is we have to walk a tightrope. We want to maintain a relationship with Iran, so we have to do something. We have to do it in a way, though, that doesn't piss off the people we're trying to make love us. And so that is all interplaying in there, and Xi Jinping is the decision maker. And we don't know what he's being told, and we don't know how he's interpreting it. Historically, though, he is an admirer of two historical developments. He is a big admirer of Mao Zedong, and he is an avid student of the Tang dynasty. The key reason for that is the Tang dynasty's military adventures led to the collapse of the dynasty and the opening of the Anlushan revolt, the most costly revolt in human history. And it cost China its influence in what's now Central Asia. And it almost led to China being invaded. In fact, Tibet conquered 20% of Chinese territory during that revolt. And so Xi has his own historical view, and I can't represent it to you, I only know he studied that dynasty. And he has his own efforts to maintain control over the levers in China. In fact, the CMC just issued a statement calling for absolute loyalty from the PLA, and so forth. And so Iran is a complex web of pain. And which one of the threads of that spider's web you pull simply determines which spider bites you. It doesn't necessarily clear it away. So that's their view so far.
Thank you.
Fig, you kind of intrigued or triggered a thought when you started off your talk with stating that Germany had accepted responsibility. At least that was my take, but correct me if I'm wrong. At least on a...
Steve, I'd say they were issued responsibility and thus accepted it. Collective responsibility.
Versus Japan.
Where it was not the whole country, not truly collective, not the industrials, not even the Kempeitai were collectively punished. Gestapo and the SS were.
Okay, so I agree, and you're familiar with the Yasukuni Jinja, yeah?
No.
So the Yasukuni Jinja is shrine in Japanese, so
yeah.
Yasukuni
Yes,
shrine?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I was just there a year and a half ago, and I've been there many times, but that was the most recent. And not much of the exhibits are translated into English, and it's intentional. But I can read the Japanese, and it's very rightist. It's the best I can describe. And so I'm wondering, this is really a well-funded shrine. If you've ever been there, it's several football field, heck, it's acres. And it's well-funded, and I'm thinking you, Jim, Crissy, I know you spent your whole career in Asia. I don't know, you've been able to see on your levels what governments and military and politicians, how that lack of apology, or there have been occasional reaching out, like by Abe, there were horrible things, and even the emperor, I regret the loss of life, but there's never really been a damn moment.
Yeah. And that's because we never rubbed their nose in it. We never made the Japanese nation, and again, I'm referring to Imperial Japan's crimes, not modern Japan's, and not but we never said, eat this. And what I have here, one of the many things I've put together, is an examination of Operation Seiko, the retribution campaign, Xizang, Jiangji campaign. And if you want to puke, read the details of who they killed and how they killed them.
Oh, yeah.
300,000 people
And that was just.
But we never made all of Japan accept that as the truth. We never made them accept as the truth what happened in the Philippines and was discussed by a panel here. We never made them accept as a truth what happened after the Mukden incident in Manchu. We never made them accept responsibility for the horrors of the rape of Nanjing.
So
We never made them acknowledge that 12 to 20 million Chinese were murdered, not victims of war, murdered. And again, this is not an anti-Japan statement, it's a reality. And a failing of America, because they were on our side as
keeping the Soviets,
diverse as they
right.
were, we have not properly mourned the sacrifices of the Chinese who made our victory possible.
Totally agree.
If
So
they
how do we
didn't- Even if they, I'll be in the city that I can't pronounce, it's like Chizhou, where Doolittle was actually picked up. I'll spell it for you. Yeah, maybe. Q-U-C-H-O-U, whatever.
Changsha, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what they put in my email. Yeah, Chicho. I'll be there to give a talk about that on April 16th. Please feel free to buy a ticket and join me.
Sure.
And this does not excuse any of the misdeeds of the communist Chinese. This is 300,000 civilians were murdered. Somebody should say, we're sorry, the Japanese, and and thank you, the Americans. Sorry, this is something I think about every day.
No, I'm completely with you. So how do you remedy this? What do you do, Jim?
Okay, I totally agree up to a point. You know, I mean, in my first year in China, it was the Asia Games were being held in Beijing in the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre. And for 3 weeks, every newscast started off with a lengthy disposition about the Opium War and the horrors of the humiliation of China for 100 years. Well, you know, heck, I'm half Irish, and I'll tell you, the humiliation of China is nothing compared to what the Irish endured for 500 years. It's nothing to what South Asia endured under British occupation either. The Chinese government has a conscious policy of pushing these tales of humiliation, which are true. And I'm not disputing the truth of it, but I'm just pointing at the fact that it's a government policy to make sure that all 1.4 billion Chinese feel this humiliation to a degree that the 1.4 billion Indians don't feel about the British occupation, or the 3 million Irish don't feel about the 500 years. It's a
program. And I couldn't agree more. When I was in Beijing, Dandong, Shenyang, and Changchun in September, on the 80th anniversary of the end of the anti-Japan war, I got taken to every possible museum and got all of that. And the century of humiliation is one thing. 300,000 dead people, bayoneted, murdered, with poisoned water and other epidemics spread in that specific group. That's different. That's 300,000 dead human beings, and if we believe in the sanctity of human life, and I do, we should talk more about it.
I agree entirely, but I would also point out that historical hindsight is painful. You know, I mean, the Chinese had to admit after Mao died that he was perhaps 70% right and 30% wrong. Yeah, 35 million dead because of the Great Leap Forward, stupid economic policies, leading to 35 million Chinese deaths. That's never going to be revisited as long as the party holds power. And in fact, they are now changing that percentage again to make it clear that, well, Mao made a few mistakes, but he was a great guy, did a lot of great things, and the Chinese progressed under his wise and benevolent rule. So and speaking about Dan Dong, I've been saying this to several people, but when you go to the Dan Dong Museum about that war, it has that little thing on inside where on, I forget the exact day, but January 1950, the Resist America, Aid North Korea war broke out.
It just magically appeared.
Magically appeared as 19 North Korean divisions rolled into the south?
Yeah, that was June 25th, 1950.
Yeah. Oh, it was June, not January. Excuse my error.
The Chinese, and, well,
That's a great example of rewriting history, but it's also a great example of the fact that they didn't do that for North Korea. All of the narrative at that museum, I've been there a couple times, it's all about the socialist and Northeast Asian Brotherhood BS. They were concerned because we were dropping bombs occasionally into China. You can still see the bridges that were destroyed by B-29s, but that was all about China.
Okay, so we've teed up our next 3 seminars. That'll take us through the year. No, we're definitely going to revisit these types of issues, Steve. And clearly, they're all born out of, to a large measure, World War II. Okay, so I'm going to hand off to Gil. He's going to make a special presentation.
Oh boy. Thank this panel very much. Please. Wow. I'm struck by the fact that Dan in particular, what you've talked about requires or ought to require the joining together of people. People will eventually make this reconciliation happen. And what you're doing by going to China, by bringing this up, is magnificent and necessary. And I'd like to introduce another gentleman here to say a couple of words. Manny Perlman, who also is working at the people level, which is what the Journey to Peace is attempting to do too, particularly with our younger folks. So Manny, please.
Thank you. If only the world would sing a message with one true voice. Today we heard one voice. Here we are on sacred ground. When my late father, of blessed memory, was 16 years old, Pearl Harbor took place, and he decided on his 17th birthday that he would go and enlist in the United States Marine Corps. He learned a great lesson from his own father, my grandfather, who was born in Jerusalem in 1892. And when we were growing up, he spoke Arabic and Hebrew, and eventually English. It's the times in which we live. You know, my faith has always been indicted because it's called the chosen people. I don't look at it as a chosen people. I look at it as a choosing people. And every single person up here chose well. They sounded like one true voice. We're so busy with the left and the right and the wrong. I mean, the truth is, you have to communicate and you have to educate. So my wife and I travel the world. We just built a school in Nigeria, never had been there before. We gave out 400 diplomas, and now we're going to Shanghai, Beijing, Xi'an, Korea, Hong Kong, and we'll continue to sing wherever we go. because music is a universal language. Music. When we sing together, so at the UN, in Geneva, The Hague, and of course in New York, I have people singing that hate each other. They literally hate each other. But somebody has to do it. And it doesn't always have to fall on our military or first responders. Sometimes retirement means that you have to work harder than you did even before. So I want to thank all of you for inspiring us. And I'm going to recommend that what you said today be divided into episodes and replace the things I'm watching on Netflix, please.
Oh, thank you, Manny. Thank you very much. So, John, I'm going to turn this back over to you in your able hands.
Okay, in the spirit of passing the buck even further, is Dennis still here? Okay. Before I turn it over to Dennis, we do have a tradition here with Journey to Peace, and for new members of our panel or moderators, we present the Hawaiian hook to Crissy for your participation. A couple of reasons why. One is which we hope you're now hooked, and so we'll see you here again and again. But the tradition of the Hawaiian hook is it's a connection of the people to the ocean, which is bounty and plentiful, but it's also a connection of people with people. And so that's kind of what we're all about here. And so thank you for being part of the team today, and hopefully, Doug permitting, you'll be back. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Dennis, the president of the Pearl Harbor Rotary Club, and of course one of our key partners. Dennis?
Thanks, John. Hey, wasn't this amazing, you guys? I mean, just truly amazing. Manny just said something that I just came back from a huge Rotary event. You know, Rotary is a worldwide organization of clubs of people that just volunteer to help the community, right? They've literally worldwide almost eliminated polio over a several year period. There's like 30,000 Rotary clubs in 200 countries. About 1.2 million Rotarians, many of them in this room right here. And at this event, we had this great conversation, and it gets to what Manny was saying. Rotary is in every country in the world, essentially, and they get together, right, and they do good things. And we said, how can that happen when you have, you know, Rotarians from Arab countries working with Israel, and like that, people that disagree? And you know what the answer was? We don't do politics. We're above it. And these guys here, exactly like Manny said, they're all speaking with one voice. And that's what we need to do. We need to follow that example of Rotary and others and get above the politics up to the humanitarian level. And that's a hard thing to do, but we can do it. So I just wanted to thank the sponsors one more time, the Hawaii West Point Society, the East-West Center, the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, Pathways to Peace, the Miss International Hawaii Organization, and lastly, our club, the Rotary Club of Pearl Harbor. And one more thanks to the panel, John, Crissy, Vig, Jim, and Carl. So another big round of applause for the panel, please. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rowan and Jasmine for any final thoughts.
Is this on? Oh, it's on. Thank you all for coming. This concludes the event. Mahalo for coming, and drive safely.